More? Oh boy. So we'll have one silent session for meditation, for shamatha in particular. And the central theme of shamatha is very simple, and to my mind it should be taught in every school in the world. Within a Muslim context will be fine, or atheist is fine. But developing one's attention skills and learning how to really control one's mind, to master one's mind. It's hard to think of anything really more important. In classical India, one of the common metaphors for the human mind is an elephant. And if you think back 1,500 years, the elephant could be a weapon of mass destruction. I don't think they had anything more powerful. If you think about it, spears, arrows, elephant. And so if it's a war elephant, that's something really to be terrified of. It can wipe out a village, kill many people. A wild elephant rut is a real force of nature to be dealt with, usually always to your disadvantage. But if you can tame it, of course, then you have a tremendous workhorse there, a work elephant, that can do marvelous deeds for you. And so when we think of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, atomic, we didn't discover any of those. We didn't just kind of bump into them someplace. Oh, look, there's a nuclear weapon. Thank you, God. They were created by minds wishing to create them. So what's the real weapon of mass destruction? The chemical, the atomic, or is it the human mind behind it? I think the human mind is the most dangerous weapon of mass destruction. It can lead to massive bigotry and hatred. It's happened so many times in history. And I would love to see that there was some culture that is immune to that, but I haven't found it yet. Obviously, America is not immune. Great Britain's not immune. And so the mind is an incredibly powerful thing. And it's not physical. It has no physical attributes. You can't measure it physically. But what's more powerful than the mind? And when it's a mind on the loose, a mind under the domination of delusion, hatred, greed, incredible destructive power. We can see what it's doing to the ecosphere. What's doing it to the ecosphere? Big oil, carbon, automobile industry, capitalism, human mind. If there were no human mind behind that, we'd not be spoiling our own environment. So the human mind, when it's undisciplined, when it's dominated by mental afflictions, can destroy a whole ecosphere. But when it's cultivated, it's refined, it's tamed and subdued, it can create the most marvelous things that have ever been seen on earth, that are human-made. I mean, objects of art, technology, science, literature, and spirituality. So to learn how to train and subdue this human mind, it's really hard to imagine anything more important than that. Attention is a good start. Cultivating the sublime virtues of the heart, loving kindness and so forth, absolutely marvelous. But for that you also need to be able to direct your attention. If your mind is scattered, it's kind of, not so useful. So let's have one session, and let's focus this evening on the current that we've been focusing on today, these variations on the theme of mindfulness of breathing, which is such a soothing and calming and gentle way to train the mind. There's nothing harsh about it. Very, very gentle. If we think sometimes the mind is likened to a horse, if it is, then this way of training the mind is the horse whisperer. The horse whisperer gently and lovingly and in companionship with the horse, working together, sharing desires, that the horse seems to be obeying you, but in fact it's simply agreeing with you. It's really quite lovely. I don't pitch movies very often, but if you ever want to see a movie about a bodhisattva cowboy, see the movie. Maybe it's available here in the UK. Buck. It's a true story. You see it? Wasn't that impressive? A real bodhisattva as a cowboy, a rootin' tootin' cowboy, but so inspiring, and just the love between him and his horse is just something to delight in. So that was a bit of a tangent. So today let's run our horse through its paces, and that is we can walk and we can trot and we can canter and we can gallop. In one session, you might, if you like, just take yourself step by step. Full body awareness, settle body, speech and mind, mellow out, get still. Full body awareness, and then rate up the ante a little bit, come to the abdomen, bring to the crescendo to the nostrils, and have 24 minutes filled with that way. Or just choose one method. If you find one method really works for you, any one of those methods is good enough to get you all the way to shamatha. So let's practice one session in silence. follow your own method that you find of greatest benefit to yourself. So there are quite a few questions or comments here. I'm not sure, I rather doubt that there'll be enough time for me to address all of them, so I'll need to be somewhat selective. And I'll be selecting those that most directly pertain to what we've been covering here in this first day or so. And I'll do that for the rest of the time as well. It's going to be a lot of dense material, quite compact, and so if we can have clarity with respect to that over these 6 days, I think that'll be a good achievement. But here's one that's certainly relevant, and that is, what could be a neural correlate of the substrate or of the substrate consciousness if there is one? If it's true, as pretty much all Buddhist schools assert, that there's a subtle continuum of consciousness that carries on from lifetime to lifetime, then that would exist prior to the formation of your brain, and when your brain stops functioning, it shuts down as a brain, it will continue. So that would mean that there wouldn't be any correlate to brain activity, since it can be present without brain activity. That said, it's very well known that when one is dreaming, I mean, so many neurophysiological studies have been done when people are dreaming, and if anything, the brain is more active when you're dreaming than it is in the waking state. And then we also need to be aware that the brain is more than an organ to help generate thoughts and so forth. It controls or is implicated in a wide variety of physiological processes throughout the entire body. So the brain never stops, it never sleeps. And the notion, of course, that we're using only 10% of the brain is just complete fiction. What could be studied, and I think it must have been but I'm not a neuroscientist, is when you're in deep dreamless sleep. Well, in the Buddhist view, also not only Tibetan Buddhist view, Theravada. In Theravada view, they don't say substrate consciousness, they say bhavanga. Bhavanga is a grounded becoming. It looks like, for all the world, like it's equivalent to the substrate. So you're resting in the substrate, which means, we're going to Theravada here, that when you're resting in the bhavanga, all the activities of the mind, the active functions of perception, memory, emotion, thinking, and so forth, all of those are dormant. So it's like a seesaw. If jhavana, the activities of the mind, are active, the bhavanga is invisible. Tip the seesaw, bhavanga manifests, that occurs only when all the jhavana, or activities of the mind, are dormant, which means the correlated activities of the brain, correlated to the activities of the mind, they would be dormant, but the brain as a whole is never dormant. So it's a subtle question. Maybe there will be a scientific answer, but certainly they know a lot about the sleeping brain. But within that haystack, is there a correlate of consciousness? What I can say is I know one of the world experts, I know him personally, Christoph Koch, previously at Caltech, now at the Allen Institute of Neuroscience up in Seattle, Washington. He's the director of it. A very, very eminent neuroscientist. He spent years looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, assuming, of course, that they exist, which he does, he still does. He worked with Francis Crick, and the neural correlates of consciousness are just this: what is the minimal amount of brain activity that is needed to generate consciousness? Of course, they're assuming it generates consciousness, which I don't accept at all. And lo and behold, they haven't found it. Well, if there is no minimal amount of brain activity, because the brain never generates consciousness anyway, then you're looking for something that doesn't exist. So that could take a long time. But this is testable. This could look like this is kind of a battle, the old age Gaga-Maggot battle between religion and science, and it's really not. Because the Buddhist hypothesis here is one you can test. If people want to take it on faith, they're welcome to do so. So many people take materialism on faith. But this is really empiricism versus dogmatism. But there's a very simple test here. And I hope it will be tested definitively by scientists and contemplatives working together in the near future. I'll be really, really brief now because we have a lot of questions. But here's the simple question. Where are memories stored? Memories. What you had for breakfast this morning, where you lived when you're 5 years old, etc. And for that matter, if there are memories of past lives, where are they stored, right? And so the overwhelming assumption, based on some compelling evidence that is compelling, but to my mind clearly not definitive. That is, it's interesting. You can see the reasoning behind it, and that is the way it's stated is memories are encoded in the brain. That's a common way of phrasing it. Which means, in a manner of speaking, they're stored in the brain. Your brain dies, your memories don't go anywhere, they just vanish. And that's a hypothesis for which I see the reasoning behind it. I just don't see it as conclusive. And the Buddhist view is completely different. And it is testable. And that is, memories are not stored in the brain any more than your apps and your programs are stored in your keyboard. Damage the keyboard, you might not have access to your apps anymore, or to your memories or your programs. Damage the keyboard enough, Coca-Cola, hot coffee, and what have you, and you might not be able to access any of your programs. But that doesn't imply that your programs are encoded in the keyboard. They're encoded in something, an entirely different place. So the Buddhist view is all of your memories are stored in the substrate consciousness. It's a testable hypothesis. I won't go into it right now. Too many questions are waiting. So here's another one. In the languages that I speak, namely English and Portuguese, we use the same word, dream, to describe an aspiration, a deep desire. I dream of going to Tahiti one day. We say that in English as well. Or the mental events that happen when we sleep. Is that the same in Tibetan? No, it's not. English, as you said, I just dream of riding my own race car, etc. We all know that. And so you have that in Portuguese. English, Portuguese, common. They never say that. Nobody says that in Tibet. Nothing. So the answer is no. Why do you think two completely different mental activities are named the same way? Language has no master. Languages evolve. Words come into play, they fall out of play, and it's a democracy. The people who write the lexicon, who write dictionaries, they're not in charge. They just listen to what people say, and they say, okay, now this means something. What was one of my favorites? What's it called when you run naked? Streaking. Streaking, yes? Okay, streaking. When people don't run naked anymore, that word's just going to die. They've thought it was cool for a while, and then, especially men, dingle, dangle, dingle, dangle. It's really awkward. Why would you want to run naked with a jockstrap at least? Okay, so words come up and they go. They just come and go, and they mean exactly what people mean when a lot of people say that. So that's how it happens. So does lucid dream reveal our deepest and more meaningful desires? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. When you're lucid, you can do in the dream whatever you like. So not necessarily your deepest. I mean, sex. I mean, that's what some people use it for. Maybe that's their deepest desire, or just one that gives them most immediate gratification. So it may be very deep. I would say this, lucid dreaming can be very trivial, and it can be immensely deep, and it all has to do with everything, with your motivation and what you do when you're lucid. Like kind of life. Why do some lamas not sleep? Because they don't need to. Yeah. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was famous for this. For years and years he didn't sleep, until I heard just recently, His Holiness Dalai Lama said, you're not young anymore. Please sleep a bit. And so I heard Lama say, okay, if you insist, I'll sleep. But it's just like, my interpretation of that, I mean, he's a natural yogi, but my interpretation of that is if your mind is so it runs so smoothly, there's hardly any friction, hardly any wear and tear. It's just so pliable, so subtle, so malleable, that you can do everything you need to do during the course of the day and just not get tired out. And so he would just be awake all night for year after year. Yang Rinpoche, one of my lamas, he's passed away now, but when he was into his 80s, he was still sleeping only an hour and a half at night. And this is what it looked like. He was meditating, and then that was his night's sleep, And so it's just that simple. So, does it have anything to do with the phenomena mentioned in natural liberation regarding the point at the heart that is turned up when the eyes? Not necessarily. It just means that your whole body-mind system works so well, so little wear and tear, you just don't need to sleep. So there are two approaches here. Gyaltsab, one of the two principal disciples of Tsongkhapa, now this is 14th century, also said he didn't need to sleep. But then I mentioned the yogi from Shimla in northern India that we knew about back in 1992, and he would just sleep as much as he possibly could because dream yoga was his major practice. So you can hit a fork in the road, and one fork is you may go the route of just not needing to sleep anymore, in which case the only kind of dream yoga you can practice is daytime dream yoga. Or you may simply take a right instead of a left, decide dreaming is a really, really very powerful, high potency state of consciousness to be in. So I'm going to make use of it. So it can be your choice. So these are interesting questions. Everyone so far is spot on, relevant to our topic. In the initial stage of lucid non-conceptual dreaming, if I understand correctly, you explained that this begins the first differentiation of the substrate. No, it's not non-conceptual dreaming. In that sequence, substrate, movement of karmic energies, substrate consciousness, afflictive mentation, subtle, and coarse mentation. I never mentioned the word dreaming. So you can take that progression from being in deep dreamless sleep and non-lucid, and you can go directly from that by these stages right into a dream, where you have coarse mentation, subtle mentation, and then within the context of the sixth cinema of the mind, you can see, hear, touch, feel everything. It just happens to be in one cinema and not in six. So no, this was not non-conceptual dreaming. I never mentioned the term, but rather non-conceptual mentation. Mentation isn't dreaming, it's simply a faculty of the mind that enables one to distinguish this appearance from that appearance. Cold from green, a sound from a smell, that kind of thing. It's really raw and primitive. So, and then the emergence of the sense of I is that afflictive mentation. Yep, something. So what investigates this? What is the impetus for the connection? This is something that can be tested with shamatha. A lot can be tested with shamatha without ever going into Buddhism, because there's really nothing Buddhist about shamatha. Hindus invented it first. India is the mother of samadhi. Not China, not Greece, not Rome, not the Mayas. Indians really invented samadhi, and they were good at it when we're still living in caves. And then the Buddhists picked it up from them. But shamatha has no worldview. It's not a dogma. It's not affiliated or tied into any dogma. So just with shamatha alone, then you do develop the ability to go from your state right now, go into samadhi, and then just walk backwards from the mind that's full on in conceptualization and coarse mentation and differentiating this person from that person, there's Dembala, there's Tenzin, and so on, to then pulling back from that, but lucidly. This is the whole point, and we will explore this during the mid part of this retreat. Pulling back from that full-on mental engagement with reality and just going backwards, but lucidly, back to subtle mentation, non-conceptual mentation, back to bumping into this primal sense of I am that is pre-linguistic, pre-conceptual, and then stepping right back into the substrate consciousness and doing that lucidly. If you can walk backwards, that is, devolve back into this ground, then you should be able to, why not, when you're coming out of meditation, watch every single step. You're resting in the substrate consciousness, and now you're going to emerge out of meditation, just watch it step by step, and then give a report on what you saw. So, it's, I really love shamatha for many reasons. By itself, it's not all that important, frankly, but within a meaningful context, it's tremendously meaningful. And it's so transparent, it really lends itself to very rigorous scientific research, and it's begun 12 years ago. We ran the Shamatha Project, immensely productive scientific study for which they're still producing more papers. So we define consciousness as something that cognizes phenomena. Does it imply some duality right in the definition? Nope, it doesn't. Here's the Buddhist definition. It's radically empirical. No faith in development. There's no religion here at all, no philosophy. But when people see consciousness nakedly, that is, nakedly means not with all the elaborations and the coverings, the concepts, the associations, the thoughts, the language, and so forth. Nothing wrong with those. But then your consciousness is embedded in a much more complex mix. Whereas when you go into samadhi right on the very nature of awareness itself, something we'll also explore in this retreat, which will lead directly to, and strongly correlated with, lucid dreamless sleep. It can take you right there. Then when you're seeing it in its kind of raw, unconfigured, unelaborated, simple, primal form, number one, it's not a person, it's not a soul, it has no gender and so forth, it's not human. It just has two defining characteristics, and they're just simple. And it's the most, I've read so many definitions of consciousness by psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers, and theologians. And this is the one that just seems the squeaky cleanest. And that is that which distinguishes consciousness from everything that is not consciousness, is consciousness has two defining characteristics. One, consciousness has the capacity to manifest appearances. whether they're visual or the appearances of emotions or desires, of memories, of sounds, of smells, any type of appearances, these are qualia. It's consciousness that makes them manifest. And this is why it said that consciousness is clear or luminous. Not that it's bright or shiny or has a color, but it's luminous in the sense that it illuminates or makes manifest all manner of appearances. Were there no consciousness, there would be no appearances. So if there was no consciousness in the universe at the time of the Big Bang, 13.7 billion years ago, if there were no consciousness, then the Big Bang would be a big... no bang. No bang. There wouldn't be any appearances. It wouldn't look like anything. It wouldn't sound like anything. What would anything sound like in empty space where there's no sound waves anyway? So that's one. And that's something you can see. Does your awareness have the capacity to make manifest dreams and everything else that appears to awareness? Well, it's awareness doing that. But we not only pick up appearances. So when I gaze at Nicola's t-shirt, I just look, boom, and I just pop, comes a color gray. Without my knowing, even if I had no name for gray, I just look and it just pops right out at me. And that's just, he's not naked. Gray. That's not his skin. But no, even before then, it's just seeing gray. It's hearing the sound, or pet is a very common one. Just that. And so that's appearance. But then I look over at Nicola, and I'm not only seeing gray, but I'm saying, oh, you're wearing a shirt. I'm knowing something. I'm not just experiencing an impression, a color, a sound, an appearance, but I know something. Nicola is not naked. I'm sure of that, because I checked. And therefore we allow him to stay. But it's that knowing aspect. And we all know what knowing is, and if you don't know, I can't tell you. And so those two, and I look at it and say, I think that suffices. And then the notion that mechanisms of artificial intelligence, robots, computer programs, and so forth, that they know anything at all, I think is sheer speculation. I doubt that it's working here. No, it's not working right now. I was about to ask Siri a question, but she's not here. She. No, my computer says Siri is not available. I called her up and she wouldn't answer. But does Siri know anything at all? Nothing. The programmers knew an awful lot. Brilliant programs. So that's it. So that's testable. And it's not to say it's the only definition, but I found for now 30, 40 years that I've been aware of it, it just strikes true and it's very useful. Please say more about reification. Where is the boundary between reifying something and identifying something? Very good. These are wonderful questions. Thank you. Reification, it's a Western philosophical term, comes from the Greek, res as in real. And so it's a Western philosophical term, but it corresponds very closely to the Buddhist term of dembarazimba, grasping to something as being real. And when we're saying that, we're saying, is it really there? There's a paper that just came out by Donald Hoffman, and I think the question is reality real? And he's asking a really good question. It's not a silly question, it's actually a very astute one. And his conclusion is no. As a neuroscientist who's pretty savvy about modern physics, cutting edge, he's a smart guy. And he works across disciplines, which is wonderful and rare. And so reification is when we grasp onto something as being really there from its own side, by its own nature, waiting to be discovered. Before anybody thinks about it, before anybody looks at it, it's just waiting, I'm already here. It can be objective, it can be subjective. We can reify the mind, we can reify objects. We tend to do both. We can reify ourselves, we tend to do that. And so that's reification. And either things exist that way or they don't. And as we'll see starting tomorrow, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as one Buddhist philosophy, but it's a gradation. And I hope you'll enjoy the tour. We're going to do a tour of different ways of viewing a reality within Buddhism and see the variety there. It's very sophisticated, and these systems of ways of viewing a reality, I think, have an enormous amount of intelligence in them, but there's a progression, and broadly speaking, as we go from the first two, they look an awful lot, in spirit, the taste of it, an awful lot like classical physics, like Newtonian physics. They really, really make sense. There's absolute space out there, there's absolute time, and there's real particles, and they bump into each other, and they operate in law-like way. And by gum, the Newtonian worldview just makes really good sense. And yet if you look very closely, even though it is still brilliant, it's rooted in some fundamentally false assumptions. And that's where it gets interesting. Because Newton is now as great now as he was 400 years ago, but the underlying assumptions turn out to be false. Yeah? So we'll see that in Buddhist philosophy as well. I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I do, because it will not just be philosophy 205, it's going to be experimental philosophy. Experimental philosophy. So we're going to relate everything to experience. I hope you'll find it meaningful. And it will all relate to the dream-like nature of reality. So did I cover that one? Maybe not quite. Oh, and then identifying something. To identify something doesn't necessarily mean to reify it. So I'll go back to Tenzin. You're right, sitting there right in front of me. So I can say, who's that? Oh, I remember Tenzin. I remember Tenzin. That's him right there. To simply identify something doesn't necessarily mean to grasp onto it as existing from its own side. Simply, I recognize him versus other people. So let's elaborate a little bit. Again, the brilliant Tsongkhapa, one of the most powerful geniuses to appear in the whole history of Tibet, as well as a great sage and so forth. But just the sheer power of his intellect, I find just awesome. And so he brings his mind to philosophy, and incredibly sophisticated, is my impression, and many other people. He makes this point. I think it's very useful. And that is, there's three ways that we can engage with reality, broadly speaking. 3 ways of apprehending reality. And one is, when I look over at Tenzin, he really looks like he's totally over there, existing in and of himself. And if I had really long arms, I'd reach out and poke him in the arm to see if he's really there or not. And I know what I'd feel like. It's kind of a bit firmer than mine, more muscle, more meat, but it'd still be squishy. And I say, "Oh, are you really there, Tenzin?" And I'll poke him, and yeah, he's really there. I touched him. He's really there. And so his body seems to be totally there from his own side. That's how things appear. Generally speaking, equally in a dream as well as in the waking state. Things appear as if they exist from their own side. And so if we uncritically simply assume that things exist in the way they appear, then we not only see him appearing as from his own side, but we grasp him as such. That he's really over there, independent of perception and conceptual designation, he's really there. That's reification. That's one thing we can do. And then all mental fictions can come out of that. We may have profound insight through deep empirical contemplative investigation, using reasonings and so forth, and come to a decisive conclusion that nothing exists in that fashion, that everything that arises is arising in mutual interdependence, and really look into the theme of dependent origination, and thereby see that nothing actually exists from its own side, and yet they do manifest and engage in causal interactions. So you may view them as being empty of inherent nature. That's the second way. And a third way, I hope this is not just blathering on, but the third way is where you just pause right in the middle. You don't actually grasp onto them as inherently real, existing from their own side, but nor do you see that they don't exist from their own side. You're just kind of non-committal, quite in between. You're not questioning. You're not going that far. And he said, these are 3 modes. The 3 modes. I think I found that to be very true. So then we move on. Here's a big one. I'm trying to understand better the different levels of mind. See below, traditional teaching. Traditional means Gelugpa. So that's traditional for Gelugpas, but also generally new translation schools, and it's a very good categorization. Gross mind, or I don't like gross because that's not like gross. Coarse mind's probably a bit better. Coarse mind, Sembrakpa, coarse mind, and that's the one that arises independence upon the brain, whatever kind of brain you have, your operating mind, so that's coarse one. Generally, it's pretty close to the psyche that psychologists study. Subtle mind is equivalent to the substrate consciousness. Gelugpas don't use that terminology, alive vijnana, but it's the same. His Holiness points that out, and actually Tsongkhapa points it out. Because Nagarjuna does refer to the substrate consciousness in the Bodhicitta Vivarana, and Tsongkhapa says he's saying substrate consciousness, but that's simply the subtle continual mental consciousness. So hopefully there's not too much detail. Very subtle mind. So your answer is yes, you're right. Coarse mind is what's called simply mind in Dzogchen. Subtle mind is the substrate consciousness, not the substrate. And the very subtle mind is equivalent to pristine awareness. So says the Dalai Lama, so says an enormous amount of evidence. So yes, you got that one right. And that's correct, that the subtle mind is located in indestructible heart drop in the heart chakra. Exactly right, also true for pristine awareness. Jolly good, oh. Are the traditional and Dzogchen teachings the same? No, are they complementary? Are they compatible with each other? Emphatically, yes. And several years ago, His Holiness asked me to translate 7 very dense, high-level, extremely sophisticated essays by 2 top-notch scholars who had mastered both the Gelugpa and Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And the point of all of the essays by these 2 authors was to show the complete compatibility between the Gelugpa understanding and Mahamudra and Dzogchen. His Holiness specifically asked me to translate that. One of the most challenging translation tasks I've ever done, but it's published. It's in a book called Open Mind. And I think the authors really make a very strong case. And then we can ask His Holiness, is Dzogchen compatible with Prasangika Madhyamaka? The answer will come out in a millisecond. Yes, definitely, no question. And I found that with my own studies. When in, for example, one of my books called Fathoming the Mind, a commentary to Vipassana within the Dzogchen tradition, it's perfectly clear that when he's talking about emptiness, it's only in accordance with Prasangika Madhyamaka. It's not Svatantika Madhyamaka, it's not Chittamatra, it's only compatible with Prasangika Madhyamaka. The evidence is completely clear because they speak about phenomena existing independent upon conceptual designation. Nobody else says that. And that they do not exist independent of conceptual designation. That's the hallmark of Prasangika. How does awareness, consciousness interact with the 3 levels above, or is it the same? Well, awareness and consciousness then cover all 3. That is, the coarse mind is conscious, subtle mind is conscious, very subtle mind is conscious. And I think we'll get more into the details of that as the days go by. That'll be my job. Consciousness cannot be, something, Newtonian law of conservation, consciousness cannot be created or destroyed. That's exactly it, yeah. It doesn't arise from nothing, because nothing arises from nothing. Nothing's nothing, so how can anything come out of it? And that's just common sense, it's kind of a priori. Mass energy doesn't come out of nothing. Space-time doesn't come out of nothing. Nothing is barren. There's nothing there to come out of. But as we find that conservation rules for space-time and for matter-energy, no compelling theory has ever been presented after 150 years of trying to somehow explain how consciousness emerges from matter. Just none of them are compelling, none of them are even testable. It's just a belief. And if you try, you have brilliant minds trying in philosophy, neuroscience, and so forth, and after 150 years, they just haven't come up with anything that can't even define consciousness, and that's a true statement. Then you might start viewing the notion of a biological explanation of consciousness as being a dead end, just like the ether. Assumed, oh, by the way, there's no evidence. Oh, by the way, there's contrary evidence. Give it a rest. Because it never led anywhere. It's not had any explanatory power ever. And I say the next statements with a lot of sadness in my heart. Because there's still a widespread belief in some areas, in like neuroscience, neurology, pharmacology, that all mental diseases are nothing more than brain disorders. And that's not only false, but it's catastrophically false. And it's completely unsupported by the evidence, completely demolished by the evidence, just like the ether. No supporting evidence, massive contra-evidence, and yet the pharmaceutical industry is still making billions of dollars every year touting that notion that depression is just a matter of chemical imbalance in your brain. It's complete hogwash. I'm not criticizing science here, I'm criticizing hogwash. This is not science. And I say this with sadness and some passion, because people are really suffering from that. It's terribly reductionistic and dehumanizing. And it's not true. If it were true that mental diseases were brain disorders, then pharmacology would have healed so many brain disorders by now. They have not healed one. All they do is suppress symptoms. So I feel strongly about that. Nobody has to agree, of course. Which is the connection between lucid dreaming and coming out of one's gross physical body in your dream body? We're talking, number one, if we want to accept this as a real possibility, out-of-body experiences. There's not much evidence, but there's enough. There's a little bit of evidence. I've seen two accounts, one from Arizona, the other one from the UK, where somebody has a near-death experiences, or they're actually dead, the brain dies for a while, And they not only continue having experiences, but they actually witness the environment where their body is. I've seen 2 accounts that are compelling. It's like a white crow. If you can find one white crow, white crows exist. If there's one account of a person having a veridical out-of-body experience, then it's true. You don't need 100. If it happens ever, then it happens. And so this is within Tibetan Buddhist practice of dream yoga on a very, very high level. Up in the stage of completion practice, where you're generating a mind-made, or actually energy, prana, a prana-made body, which you can then project in different places. This is very, very high level. And I just take that like I take everything else in Buddhism. Gosh, let's test it. I respect religious beliefs. I believe in karma and I can't test it. But I believe it not just because I like the idea. I don't like the idea at all. I don't like the idea of samsara, frankly. I think it really sucks. But I have so much confidence in the Buddha, an enormous amount of confidence in the continuity of consciousness. One friend of mine asked me, what do you believe in more firmly, gravity or the continuity of consciousness? Continuity of consciousness. Who really understands gravity? So any help would be, started here. Whoops. Okay, maybe it starts here. Dear Alan, ding. Siri, is that you? Any help would be appreciated. Although experiences come from mind, I wonder sometimes whose mind? Is it possible to connect and communicate with other beings from different realms? The word from, I think, every religious tradition on the planet, including all contemplative, the answer is yes, definitely. Sure, definitely. And so I guess there is no inside or outside ultimately, which then throws me into confusion. The fact that there's no inside and outside ultimately doesn't mean there's no inside and outside. And that is, by and large, is a strong generalization that has exceptions. When you're dreaming, an ordinary dream, it could be also a lucid dream, the contents of the dream, the kind of people that come up, the situations, the languages you hear and so forth, the content is coming from memories, your memories. Memories in this lifetime, I'm firmly convinced, they could, especially during that last phase of dreaming, the last 2 hours, it's possible that you might have dreams for which the raw stuff is coming from past life. I think that's very feasible. So that would be, and so generally speaking, when you're dreaming, all the contents are coming from your own individual continuum of consciousness. Now it's your own distinct continuum. It's not shared. It's distinct. But that doesn't mean it has borders, like titanium borders someplace. So, for example, the border between my body and your body. Well, it's not absolute. My body's generating heat. Your body's generating heat. My body's generating electromagnetic fields. So is yours. So heat, electromagnetic energy. There's no boundary there. So in an extremely subtle way, my body's pulling on your body, extremely subtle. So there's no absolute boundary there. In terms of also just photons being emitted and little molecules coming off the body. There's no boundary. Nevertheless, relatively speaking, mine ends here, yours starts over there. So it's like that with the mind. It doesn't have absolute boundaries, but it still has a coherence. And having said that, there are very deep meditative practices that enable you to slip outside of your boundaries. And for some people, it happens automatically, naturally. I think, I'll go to karma here, because I do find it has some explanatory power. But where there's very, very deep karmic connections, such as mother and child, sometimes siblings. It may not be a blood relationship. It could be a very deep spousal relationship. It could be guru-disciple relationship. But especially parent and child, mother and child. There are so many anecdotes throughout history and throughout different cultures of the child dies and the mother knows it immediately. The parent dies and the child knows it immediately. There's so many of them. To write them all off as, oh no, it's just coincidence. After a while, that kind of sounds stupid. And so this would be a karmic connection. I mean, some karmic connections are stronger, some are weaker, but where there's a very strong karmic connection, there can be kind of like a harmonic resonance. And something happens with one, and it may be picked up in a subtle way by the other. I think there's evidence there. It should be studied more rigorously, but I think the evidence certainly calls for respectful attention. So I guess there's So can you be between life and death, where consciousness seemingly separates from self, leaving a corpse, the body almost totally withdrawal of the senses. There's something called delo, and it was, some of you may know of the Lama, he's passed away, Chaktu Rinpoche, and his mother spent what was days and days, where outwardly she just seemed dead, but her body wasn't decomposing, and she wasn't in the clear light of death. It was just kind of like she went into deep freeze, not frozen literally, but really just the body was just no signs of life. And she reported when she came back, she toured multiple rounds of existence and came back. So it's called delo, coming back from the dead. And that's one rather well-known account. So is this possible? I think so. I think really consciousness is the great mystery for the West, because we've been always focused outwards, and you never find it outwards. But the contemplative traditions of Asia and the early contemplative traditions of the Sufi, the Kabbalah, the Christian, have so much more insight. We've hardly even begun. So I'm looking forward to meetings between contemplatives and scientists, where they both are coming together eager to learn from each other, and not simply share their insights and say, now what do you think about what I said? And there's a lot of that going on. Once I felt this for approximately 3 days and had difficulty getting back in, I had to start labeling and so forth. So yeah, there are all kinds of possibilities here. And they should be studied carefully. But your basic instrument, I'm going to sound like a broken record now, like if you want to do laser technology, you'd like to use it for removing cataracts, you'd like to use it as a weapon, you'd like to use it for creating holographs. And so many things you can do with a laser. It's an incredibly wonderful technology. Can be used for such good uses. But if you don't have a laser, then you can't do any of that stuff. And the laser for contemplative technology, for cities doing things that seem miraculous but they're not, is samadhi. Samadhi is the laser of the mind. You learn how to focus it, high energy, high frequency, and just amazing things can be done with samadhi. Testable hypothesis. Is consciousness time and space bound? The coarse mind, yes. Subtle mind, yes. Very subtle mind, pristine awareness? Nope. How many gradients of consciousness are on the consciousness spectrum? One can certainly make many more fine gradations for the 4 jhanas, the 4 absorptions in the formless realm, and so forth. But practically speaking, I find this 3-tiered model has enormous explanatory power. The coarse mind that arises independent upon the nervous system, for us biological carbon-based organisms, animals and human beings. Your coarse mind arises independent upon the body, destroy the body. That mind doesn't go anywhere. It's gone. But it doesn't vanish into nothing. It withdraws back into its source, which is the substrate consciousness, which carries on from lifetime to lifetime. So, how many gradients? Well, coarse mind, subtle, very subtle, extremely powerful in terms of explanatory power. And all can be explored with simple introspection, developing refined introspective abilities, refined attention abilities. Then an enormous amount can be learned. William James really started off really well, naturally gifted, incredibly gifted with introspection. And there were others. There was the German Wilhelm Wundt. There was Titchener, Edward Titchener, an English psychologist. Brilliant, really brilliant. And he started the most successful graduate program in introspective psychology at Cornell University. And it was a great success. Many graduate students, a lot of research. This was during the last couple of decades of the 19th century. It was really outstanding work. It was in its embryonic stage or infantile stage, but it was smart, and they were making a lot of discoveries. And then new management came in 1910. The behaviorists just shut them all down. Just shut them down. And they all vanished. It was 35 years of practicing introspection, and behavior said, basta. And they were successful. And they ran with it for 50 years, came up with kind of nothing in terms of actually understanding the mind and consciousness, actually nothing at all. And then the neuroscientists jumped into the saddle. We'll take over now. And they've come up with nothing in terms of understanding consciousness, the actual nature of the mind. How does the placebo effect work? How can you have a thought, aspiration, a hope, or trust? How can that possibly influence the brain exactly in ways that you wish? How is that possible? They don't have a clue because they're not looking at it. So, big mysteries there. But the contemplative traditions have unveiled many aspects of the mind that remain mysteries for people who don't look at the mind. The tools we use to transition from one type of consciousness to another, to what degree they differ or are similar to the ones used in state of consciousness from which we depart from the one used in the state of consciousness to which we are treading to. I think I'm too tired to read that again. So ask it again maybe. Have you encountered any paint in your life, any kind of similarities or correlation between your Buddhist practice and the 5 Platonic solids theory? I'll pass on that one, but I do find Pythagoras very compelling. From number, looks like correlated to the formless realm, to forms, looks like form realm, to this world here. Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, I find very fascinating. I think some strong correlations with Buddhism. Does panpsychism exist, or does it have relevance to consciousness? Panpsychism, that comes in a lot of varieties. I think I know the most sophisticated one. It's getting a lot of headlines these days by 2 people, Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin, and then Christoph Koch, who I mentioned. They're really, really promoting this a lot. So it's the most sophisticated version of panpsychism. The simplest, and I think the least defensible, is that electrons are conscious and atoms are conscious. The nail is conscious. I just see, why are you saying that? Why are you mouthing those words? Why are you saying that? Do you have any evidence at all? And the answer is not anything. It just seemed like a good idea at the time. I think of panpsychism as the last gasp of materialism. I really do. I mean, just before it dies. The sophisticated one is in integrated information theory. Giulio Tononi, neuroscientist, developed it. Christoph Koch, very, very bright. They've teamed up on this one. But it starts with, frankly, a leap of faith. I'll give it to you in the gist. I've written a whole paper critiquing it. I think I sent 7 torpedoes. I think any one of them would sink the ship. But it starts with this premise that a system, any system, a wristwatch or anything else, a system that holds integrated information, like any system. And information means organization. It's not consciousness, it's just organization. So it's something that can be objectively measured. The more organization there is in a system, and that's inversely related to entropy, the more information, integrated information there is, that the degrees of complexity of integrated information in a system corresponds directly to the amount of consciousness in that system. Then I ask, okay, take the simplest one, a thermometer, a thermometer, or what, a thermostat? A thermostat, got a very, very, very simple little integrated, so a thermostat, and there's some, Michio Kaku says, yeah, a thermostat has 1 unit of consciousness. He's a physicist, he has no training in mind science at all, but you just say it. But why do you say it? What's the evidence, in fact, that a thermostat has any consciousness at all? Or a wristwatch, there's a lot of integrated information in a wristwatch. Why do you say that it's conscious? And the answer is, because. They really have no evidence at all, they just say it. But once you say it, like believing something like, I don't know, believing in cherubim and seraphim, once you say it, then a lot of things can flow. But then where they go, so they start with a leap of faith, then they apply logic, and then you come to the necessary logical conclusion of this, is the internet must have an extremely high level of consciousness. And then I read Christoph Koch looking at this, and he said, but of course that's sheer speculation. But the sheer speculation of it is a logical conclusion of their initial leap of faith. So it starts with a leap of faith, proceeds with logic based on nothing at all except for logic, comes to a conclusion that you write off as sheer speculation, and that's called a scientific theory. I just don't find it compelling. Because there's no evidence to support the starting premise. Why do you say that a system with a little bit of integrated information in it, which is this degree of organization, why do you say it's conscious? And there's no answer to that. It's the last gasp. If consciousness exists, it must be equivalent to something physical. How about that? And I'm just saying, why don't you just give it a rest? Ether died, let this one die as well. This chariot has no wheels. It's not going anywhere. What about dream interpretation? Does it say anything about our mental state and about the state of the substrate consciousness? Dream interpretation, it does occur in Buddhism. So, and there's a lot of that, dream interpretation. Of course, the brilliant Jung, the brilliant Freud, one may or may not agree with many of their theories, but the fact that they were brilliant, had deep insights, I think is quite clear historical truth. But the Tibetans will also say that many dreams come just because of indigestion, or they're just dreams, somehow variations on what happened in the preceding day. So the notion that whatever comes up, I saw a white horse, that means this. And then I saw somebody drinking milk, and this means that. Assuming that just everything there must have some symbolic meaning, I have to say I'm not persuaded. But maybe it's useful to think that way. Your examples of successful lucid dreaming are always like Walt Disney. Is there a serious reason for practicing it? Could we practice a past life? Could we experience a past life of meeting the Buddha or Christ while lucid dreaming? I just want to understand the first part. Are always like Walt Disney. Is there a serious reason for practicing? I hope that will become very evident, if not already. I hope it will become very evident through the course of this, that lucid dreaming can be approached like a hobby. Fun and games, isn't it really cool? I really love it, don't you? And you can have then chat rooms about your lucid dreams. It can be just a lot of fun. It doesn't have to have any significant meaning at all, except for it's really cool. If that's your motivation, that's what it is. But when we look into dream yoga, I mean, that's just never something cool. It's not just cool. The roots of dream yoga practice are rooted in the Four Noble Truths. And so we'll look into that when we get to the latter couple of days. So the degree of significance, of meaning, of value, transformative power of your lucid dreaming and your dream yoga, I think are really contingent on two things. What's your motivation? And when you're lucid, what do? It can be totally trivial, like going to Las Vegas, or it can be incredibly profound. Because after all, to enter, I just want to make this point again, when you're in the midst of a lucid dream, you're in a whole environment that's created by your mind. If you'd like to understand your mind, wouldn't it be good to understand the mind by way of its creations? And to explore it? Is there anything more worth knowing than the nature of our own minds? Is there anything that has a greater impact on our well-being, our joys and sorrows, our successes and failures, the degree of meaning of our life? Is there anything that has a greater impact on our lives, how we lead our lives and how we die? Nature of mind. So I think lucid dreaming, dream yoga, can be a very powerful array of methods for exploring something of enormous significance. You spoke of you could see or apprehend or enter primordial substrate, or the penmanship breaks down here. Who or what is you of which you spoke? Oh yeah, we'll spend some time on that. The reference to the word I. Reference to the word I. So we have 5 days to look into that. But know thyself. Apparently that's the most ancient aphorism we have in any Western language, the Delphic Oracle. It's a very deep question. And so I'll not try to answer it now. It's very deep and it deserves to be approached again and again and go deeper, deeper, deeper. Let's just do it briefly. Some people here have attended my retreats in the past. You always then know briefly never means briefly. It means I'm trying and I fail almost every single time. But we can go from the outside in. Am I a relatively tall man? Yeah. So that's who I am. I'm a relatively tall man. You want to know who I am? I'm a relatively tall man. True statement. Superficial, but it's true, right? And then we can go deeper into the nature of mind, and then we can have as a basis of designation, I am tall, I am this. Then we can go into the mind, and we can start making a whole bunch of true statements there. But how about, let's just jump into the Buddhist worldview for a moment at least. How about if I say, in my past life, I was Tenzin Hlundup, living in Kham. I was a Tibetan guy. I just made that up. But imagine it were true, hypothetically. In my past life, I was Tenzin Hlundup, and I was a monk in this monastery. No big deal, but imagine that I remembered that. This is all hypothetical. I was Tenzin Hlundup in my past life, and I died in 1949. What's the referent now? Because it's not this guy, this California guy. I didn't live in Tibet 70 years ago. So now what's the basis of designation? When people say, in my past life, I was such and such. I'll give you one little phrase that I heard I didn't hear it directly, but I heard it from people that I know very well, and they heard His Holiness say this. And it's very rare for him to speak this way. So I'll end on that note. I was quite delighted when I heard it. Because if you've heard discourses by His Holiness, you'll hear him many times say, I'm a simple Buddhist monk, I have no realization, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Very common. Among even the most highly realized Tibetan yogis, this utter humility and just denying they have any realization. And so I heard when His Holiness, I think it was in Perth, I know it was in someplace in Australia, I think it was Western Australia, His Holiness was eschewing any type of deep realization. And then somebody from the audience, the Aussies, who tend to be a little bit blunt, which is a very good thing, I think, being direct. You know, say what you think. And so some Aussie asked His Holiness, Your Holiness, you've been practicing, I'm paraphrasing here, but the basic question was, you've been practicing for 70 years, you have a very, very intense practice, and you're the Dalai Lama, and if after all your years and decades of practice you have no realization, if we're to take literally what you just said, what hope is there for the likes of us? If you've gotten nowhere, then why should I even bother? Something like that. I mean, it's a nice, direct question. I really respect the question. And what my friends told me, you weren't there, were you, Glenn? But people like TL, I think he was there, and some other friends, maybe the other one up there at Chenrezig Institute, I think he was there. But see, people I know who are very responsible, Western Buddhists, they said, His Holiness listened to this question, and he said, you have a point. Okay, I'll level with you. And then I'm paraphrasing here, but very closely. He said, I can recall being an Indian Pandit living in the 13th century, a Mahayana Buddhist Pandit, a scholar. And then he said, and I can remember, a strong emotion comes every time I tell this, I can remember being with the Buddha. He very rarely speaks that way. But when he sees it would be really useful, then he'll open a crack of the door. I can remember being with the Buddha. When a person of that caliber, that massive integrity, and absolute honesty, and a truly brilliant mind, when it says, make a statement like that in a public setting, then my mind goes very quiet. A few other lamas will speak with that candor, but not many. But he has said that, so thus I have heard. And so it's not just hearsay. So, but to be explored. If one wanted to be very critical, say, well, that's good for him, but then I don't recall my past lives. You haven't done the work. I haven't seen, you've heard that there are exoplanets, right? They first have 5 and then 10, and now it's dozens and dozens and dozens. Exoplanets, planets orbiting around other stars. The evidence apparently is completely unequivocal. First by inference, and then actually seeing a planet coming between the telescope and the star behind, and seeing, yep, that's a planet by George. And yet I've never seen an exoplanet. And if I look at the mathematics, I don't understand it. So I'm really relying on their authority. But I think they've earned it. Astronomers, with their incredible technology, their brilliant mathematics, their integrity, their search for truth, I'm really impressed by many discoveries in astronomy. And that's one of them. But I haven't seen it. And when I see their, the muscle behind it, I can't understand it. I've not studied astronomy enough. But I have confidence in them. Astronomers, have I ever seen that, in fact, DNA is in a double helix? I've never seen that. But the people working, they have skills and technology and modes of observation I don't have. But I do have the confidence that had I made that my life's mission at the age of 20 to become an astronomer, I have every reason to believe that I would be able to test their theories about exoplanets, or I would be able to confirm, yes, DNA is in a double helix. But I just haven't given the effort to it. And I'm happy with that. I've chosen my own path. And so I'm saying this is similar here. Many people don't recall their past life. Yeah, but you haven't put in the hard work. But if you were, then we're like everybody else. All those yogis that spend 10, 20 years in retreat and they make their discoveries. Because there's no point in Buddhism, authentic teachings of Buddhism, there's no point at which the Buddha himself or any of the great teachers since then have said, just have faith. Just trust me. They never say that. The Buddha said just the opposite. Don't just trust me. Put it to the test. Put it to the test. And so I really feel at home in the Buddha Dharma. Because I really was trained in science. I love science. I respect science. When they do poorly, then it makes me very sad. Because they're not living up to their own standards. That's my only objection. But often they do, and that earns my deep admiration. But I've lived so many years with Tibetans, lived in Asia, in India and Sri Lanka and Thailand and so forth, that I have, I would say, a very comparable respect for the rigor of investigation from the contemplative side as the rigor of investigation with the scientific side. And I'm waiting for something that hasn't really happened yet, but I think it will happen soon. A true meeting of minds where both sides are really open to learning from the other side. We're getting close, but I haven't really seen that happen. Not really yet. But I think I'm getting very close. And that will be truly spectacular. Spirit of respect on both sides. Recognize the limitations and the strengths of both sides, and then saying, why don't we overcome the limitations by helping each other? I think we're very close, and I think it's going to be this younger generation that pulls it off. And my generation will help launch you. That's my sense. So, it's now, 9 o'clock. Good timing. So, what I'd like to suggest, and we may have homework now from now on, but at least tonight, homework, do it or not, nobody grading. But when you finish, whether you're going to bed in a half an hour, 2 hours, I'm a morning person, so I'm going to get to bed early because I like to get up at 3:30 or so. But when you finish the day, everything, brushed your teeth, the day's all finished, what I encourage is then go right into the supine position under the covers and really let your farewell to the day be in meditation and really practice shamatha. And that asanga approach is very, very good at the end of the day. It doesn't arouse, it doesn't wake you up. It's calming, it's soothing, full body awareness, that releasing, and continue practicing until you're going to know it, because we all know what it's like to feel drowsy. When I first get into bed, I'm very rarely drowsy, maybe once or twice a month, really drowsy. But generally I get into bed when I'm not drowsy yet. And then I meditate until the drowsiness comes, when I'm really tired. And then end your shamatha session. Don't waffle around in between. My stepdaughter Sarah coined a term, sleepitate, where what are you doing? Kind of sleeping, kind of meditating. Don't do that. That's sloppy. So practice shamatha until the drowsiness comes in, and you need sleep. You want a good night's sleep, so you wake up refreshed, invigorated, everything you need tomorrow morning. So meditate until the waves of drowsiness come in, and then end your shamatha session, shift your posture a bit, and get a good night's sleep. It's a very nice segue between actively involved in the waking state and really slipping into sleep, that you depart the day in a mode of clarity and inner calm. Very nice. So you might try it. Have a good night's sleep. See you tomorrow morning.